it is too late to escape the consequences. Lately, this increasingly applies to one leader, William Ruto, the president of Kenya, the East African country. Ruto won power about 3 years ago, and he was elected on a promise. He vowed to protect the poor to improve the well-being of young Kenyans. But has he lived up to it? If you ask the people of Kenya, in all likelihood, the answer will be a resounding no.
Something remarkable is taking shape in Africa right now. And it's not the usual scene of protests and broken promises. It's something deeper, more hopeful. It's a shift that's lighting up hearts and stirring ordinary people to build or question their nations in ways rarely seen. At the center of this unfolding story are two countries, Burkina Faso and Kenya. One is quietly forging a new path under the watch of a young, bold leader. The other is buckling under the weight of old debts and decisions that many now see as misguided. Together, they reveal two sharply different faces of modern African leadership. Let's begin in Burkina Faso. It's a small West African country that doesn't often make international headlines. But lately, it's become a quiet stage for a drama that could change how Africa thinks about power and trust. A young president named Ibrahim Traoré is at the heart of it. Unlike many African leaders who were groomed in elite circles or educated overseas, Traoré rose from humble beginnings. He didn't inherit wealth, didn't sit in foreign universities soaking up theories that rarely match African realities. Instead, he learned by living the same struggles as his people. Today, he carries that lived experience with him into crowded village squares, dusty townships, and makeshift community halls. Rather than stand behind bulletproof glass or give distant speeches, he sits cross-legged on the ground, listening to farmers who've lost land, mothers whose children can't attend school, and youths who are desperate for a chance at life. That's what makes him different. He listens, and more than that, he acts. When the powerful International Monetary Fund offered Burkina Faso a loan tied up in strict conditions, Traoré shocked the world by saying no. Global analysts called it reckless. Western papers ran worried headlines. Surely this would spell disaster. But to the people of Burkina Faso, it was a moment of rare pride. For decades, their leaders had signed papers with foreign banks, accepting loans that came with harsh conditions. Slash public services, cut subsidies, squeeze the poor to pay back the debt. The burden fell on ordinary people. So when Traoré refused, it wasn't just about rejecting money. It was about dignity. It was about telling his citizens, we don't need loan conditions. We need living conditions. Those simple words carried more weight than any polished economic plan. And remarkably, his people believed him because they saw he meant it. Instead of turning to international donors, Traoré turned to his own people. He invited village elders, teachers, students, market women, everyone, to a national gathering. There were no grand speeches promising miracles, just tough, honest questions. If you were president, what would you cut first to protect food and schools? He asked. And people answered. They offered ideas. They took ownership. Soon, farmers started donating land to community projects. Young volunteers began repairing broken schools. Entire neighborhoods banded together to guard power stations from thieves and vandals. Not because they were paid, but because they felt it was theirs to protect. Traoré didn't promise to solve all problems. He promised something rarer, a chance to build a country together. Across Burkina Faso, a quiet transformation began. People called him the son of the mainland. Others whispered that he was the second coming of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader who decades ago had tried to chart a similar course before being cut down too soon. Have you ever encountered someone whose simple courage made you believe real change was possible? That's the feeling sweeping Burkina Faso. Now let's shift focus eastward to Kenya, a country often praised as one of Africa's more developed economies. But in mid-2024, the world watched in shock as thousands of Kenyan police officers flooded the streets of Nairobi chanting, "Enough is enough." Imagine that for a moment. The very people paid to uphold law and order, to keep protests in check, were themselves protesting. Some officers even stripped off their uniforms on camera, declaring they could no longer serve a system that didn't care about them. It was more than a demand for overdue pay. It was a raw scream from inside a broken machine. Kenya's economy had been wobbling for years. Inflation shot up past 20%. The Kenyan shilling lost ground against the dollar, sending prices of basic goods spiraling. Meanwhile, The government had borrowed billions from international lenders like the IMF, and these weren't friendly loans. They came with heavy strings attached: cut public spending, freeze wages, raise taxes. Teachers, nurses, and yes, police officers bore the brunt. Many went months without pay. Allowances were slashed. Workloads grew heavier as staff thinned out. In one viral moment, a Kenyan policeman removed his badge and said quietly into the camera, "I didn't betray my country. I just can't keep serving a system with no humanity." Those words cut deeper than any statistic. They exposed the hollow core of a nation that had, for too long, chased foreign prescriptions at the expense of its own people. Suddenly, Kenya's middle class woke up. If even the police, the very backbone of state power, were rebelling, who would protect ordinary citizens from chaos? What faith could anyone have left in their leaders? And that's where the contrast becomes striking. In Burkina Faso, when faced with a budget gap, Traoré didn't hide behind foreign banks. He called on his people to step up, and they did. In Kenya, leaders followed the IMF script: raise taxes, slash salaries, tighten the belt. They didn't ask for ideas, didn't invite debate. They issued orders. And ironically, the very officers expected to enforce those policies were the first to revolt. 2 countries, 2 crises, 2 paths. As this story continues, we'll look deeper into why trust has flourished in one place and collapsed in another, why Burkina Faso's quiet revolution is inspiring, and how Kenya's turmoil might yet forge a new kind of awakening. Before we go there, pause and consider. If you were in Burkina Faso or Kenya right now, what would you be doing? Picking up tools to build? Or joining chants in the streets demanding change? As the weeks rolled on, something extraordinary began to unfold across Burkina Faso. Traoré's refusal to bow to international lenders didn't drive the country into chaos as many foreign analysts predicted. Instead, it triggered a national surge of self-reliance. Farmers who had long waited for government or donor support decided to take matters into their own hands. In the Kaya region, they pooled resources to buy local seeds and even started making their own organic fertilizers. Fields that once lay dry and abandoned began turning green again. Not because of some foreign-funded mega-project, but because local farmers decided their land was worth fighting for. Meanwhile, in Bobo Dioulasso, groups of students studying engineering and architecture took on a challenge that would have scared off many seasoned professionals. They began designing new homes built from local clay and stones instead of expensive imported cement. Their goal was simple but revolutionary: create houses that communities could afford without waiting on loans that might never come. This wasn't charity. It wasn't some handout. It was citizens, driven by the belief that their sweat was a better investment than any foreign check. In village after village, women who once waited for international food programs started baking bread from homegrown grains. Local cooperatives sprang up almost overnight. In Ouagadougou, retired mechanics gathered young apprentices to fix broken trucks and machines abandoned for years. They joked that they were teaching with rust, but behind the laughter was quiet pride. All of this grew from a single thread: trust. Traoré didn't come to the people with slick slogans or 5-point plans drafted by overseas consultants. He came with honesty. He told them times would be hard, that there would be no miracle funds pouring in, only hard work, shared risk, and shared reward. And the people responded. Contrast that with what was still playing out in Kenya. The street protests that began with police officers ripping off their uniforms were now spreading into something more than angry marches. Nurses, teachers, students, people who normally keep society running quietly, started to organize. They formed neighborhood forums, community committees, and what they called financial justice commissions. These weren't political rallies. They were serious workshops where ordinary Kenyans sat together and studied government budgets, loan agreements, and IMF conditions line by line. They printed out documents most people had never seen before. They underlined paragraphs, scribbled questions in the margins, and then began demanding answers from politicians on social media. Why are we paying billions in debt, but our hospitals don't have basic supplies? A young woman asked in a viral video, her voice trembling with frustration. Another clip showed a group of secondary school students grilling a local official about tax hikes. You keep telling us to tighten our belts, but your kids are studying abroad on scholarships we pay for. When will you tighten yours? In Kenya, this was new ground. For years, people had grumbled privately about corruption or high taxes, but rarely challenged the very structure of how their country borrowed and spent money. Now, under the pressure of economic pain, they were starting to see the deeper roots of their problems. Meanwhile, the spark that Burkina Faso lit was starting to travel beyond its borders. In online forums from Mali to Nigeria, young Africans began talking about Traoré, not as some distant celebrity leader, but almost like a friend whose courage gave them permission to dream bigger. One popular post showed a picture of a dusty farm with the caption, "Burkina Faso grows hope. What are we growing?" Another showed students in Bobo Dioulasso building mud brick houses with the line, "When your leaders stop borrowing, your youth start building." Even in Kenya, people were paying attention. During one small town hall in Kisumu, a local activist held up a newspaper clipping about Burkina Faso. "They're not waiting for the IMF. Why should we?" he asked. The room fell silent. Then an elderly teacher raised her hand and said, "Because we've been trained to doubt ourselves. Maybe it's time we unlearn that." Back in Burkina Faso, the backlash Traoré faced from international institutions didn't fade. In fact, it intensified. Credit rating agencies downgraded the country's outlook, warning investors to stay away. Western media began running editorials questioning his competence. Foreign banks quietly pulled lines of credit, and universities suddenly found their research grants drying up. To many outside observers, this looked like proof that Burkina Faso was headed for collapse. But inside the country, something else was taking shape. At the University of Ouagadougou, when professors learned their international research money was being cut, they didn't pack up and leave. Instead, they launched a new initiative where older students tutored younger ones in engineering, agriculture, and medicine, all for free. It was raw, imperfect, often held under shade trees when classrooms were too full, but it was theirs. In the farming town of Koudougou, local elders started weekend schools teaching kids how to plant diversified crops and negotiate fair prices in local markets. Their motto was simple: "If they won't teach us, we'll teach ourselves." Traoré didn't take credit, he simply let it happen. And that might be his most radical act, creating space for people to solve problems without waiting on government or foreign experts to show up with clipboards and contracts. Meanwhile, the Kenyan protests were moving from pure anger to something more complicated. In Nairobi, groups of young accountants and lawyers began volunteering their time to comb through the fine print of Kenya's $9 billion in recent loans. They posted simplified explanations online in local dialects, breaking down how much interest was being paid and what cuts were promised to secure those deals. It shocked many Kenyans who'd never seen the true cost spelled out so clearly. "We're not poor because we're lazy," one university student declared at a campus forum. "We're poor because our leaders keep selling our future to fix today's mistakes." The movement was changing shape, less about storming government buildings, more about dismantling the excuses that had kept people docile for decades. Across both countries, one quiet theme ran through everything: education. In Burkina Faso, it was a hands-on grassroots revolution where farmers taught each other soil chemistry and students designed low-cost machinery. In Kenya, it was the raw power of knowledge itself, reading documents, asking uncomfortable questions, forcing officials to justify their decisions in plain language. Which model would last longer? The one building up skills and trust brick by brick, or the one pulling back the curtain on broken systems, forcing a national reckoning? As these parallel stories continue to evolve, we'll see in Part 3 how each country is grappling with not just the costs of their choices, but the hopes they've unlocked. By late 2025, the difference between Burkina Faso and Kenya had become more than just a case study for economists. It was a living question for millions across Africa. What kind of change actually works? And how much does trust really matter? In Burkina Faso, the quiet, determined push to rebuild from within continued to pick up speed. Even as foreign banks held back credit and international agencies tried to isolate the country, local initiatives kept sprouting. In the southern province of Gawa, a group of young mechanics teamed up to refurbish tractors that had been rusting away in fields for years. They didn't have imported parts or fancy diagnostic machines, so they used what they did have: scrap metal, trial and error, and sheer stubbornness. By the end of September, they'd put 15 tractors back to work. It might seem small in global terms, but for local farmers, it meant entire planting seasons saved. Meanwhile, in the dusty outskirts of Ouagadougou, small construction cooperatives started to form. They were building clinics, classrooms, and grain storage sheds from local materials, designed by local hands. One older mason explained it simply: "Every bag of cement we don't import is money that stays here." At the same time, secondary schools were holding evening seminars where students studied community finance, learning how to keep village records, manage collective savings, and plan budgets. It wasn't part of any foreign aid curriculum. It was born from a hunger to never be so easily manipulated by outside lenders again. Through all this, Traoré remained strangely absent from the center of the stage. There were no triumphant parades or endless speeches. Instead, he kept traveling from village to village, often alone or with just a couple of aides, asking the same question again and again. What do you need, and what can you do yourselves? It was leadership by humility, and that, more than any grand plan, seemed to fuel the grassroots energy rippling across Burkina Faso. Kenya's story, meanwhile, was moving along a rockier path. The protests that had begun with police officers dropping their badges were still alive, but now they were evolving. Groups like the Financial Justice Commissions that sprouted in Nairobi were beginning to link up with university chapters across the country. They were exchanging audit documents, building shared online spreadsheets that tracked every shilling of government debt. It was raw citizen oversight on a scale Kenya hadn't seen before. One night in Mombasa, a group of fishermen who joined the protests held a community meeting where they reviewed the IMF's loan agreements with Kenya. Someone projected the scanned PDFs onto the side of a weather-beaten building. Fishermen squinted at the fine print, asking questions like, if we took out these billions in loans, why are we still fixing our boats with holes? Where did it all go? The meeting ended with no violence, no burning tires, just quiet resolve that next election, they'd start demanding candidates who actually answered these questions. But the path in Kenya was still uncertain. While more citizens were informed and asking hard questions, there were also outbreaks of chaos. Stores looted in smaller towns, local officials chased from meetings, and clashes with riot police that turned ugly. In places where anger was strongest, but community organization was weakest, the flames burned hottest. And so, two pictures were coming into focus. In Burkina Faso, a leadership style rooted in listening had sparked a constructive revolution. Communities weren't perfect, and plenty of challenges remained. But people were building, fixing tractors, mixing clay for new homes, teaching kids in makeshift classrooms. They believed the future belonged to them. In Kenya, the revolution was about pulling back the curtain on a broken system. Citizens were no longer satisfied with whispered complaints over tea. They wanted transparency. They wanted to see the receipts. They wanted leaders who didn't just speak English at international summits, but could sit down in a fishing village and explain why there was no money for nets. And so the question was changing. It wasn't just who leads better, but which kind of awakening lasts longer. Is it the hope that builds because people trust their leaders enough to pick up tools? Or the vigilance that comes from citizens watching every transaction, suspicious but determined not to be cheated again? One powerful example came from a small town outside Eldoret in Kenya. After attending several forums where young accountants explained the fine print of IMF agreements, local teachers decided they wouldn't wait for the government to prioritize their schools. They set up their own education fund, with tiny monthly contributions from parents and small local businesses. Within months, they'd bought new desks and chalkboards for 3 schools. It was a sign that even in Kenya's angriest moments, some were beginning to mix outrage with action. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, the government announced it would match community efforts with small grants, but only after locals had proven what they could do on their own. In one region, villagers dug the foundation for a health clinic by hand before the state sent cement. In another, women's groups planted trees along roads to protect fields from wind erosion, receiving seedlings from the Agriculture Ministry only after they showed they could organize. These were modest steps, but they were also revolutionary because they flipped the usual order of things. Instead of citizens waiting on government or foreign agencies to start, they began first. And instead of leaders ruling by decree, they rewarded initiative. Across Africa, people watched. Social media lit up with clips from Burkina Faso's dusty work sites and Kenya's fiery town halls. Young Africans from Lagos to Lusaka debated in WhatsApp groups. Which model should we follow? Build first like Burkina Faso? Or audit first like Kenya? Maybe the answer wasn't either or. Maybe the real lesson was that both were essential. You need trust to start building, and scrutiny to keep leaders honest. By December, as another year closed on a continent too often dismissed by outsiders, a quiet conviction was taking hold in many hearts. Real change doesn't begin with billion-dollar loans or televised summits. It starts when people decide they won't wait anymore, when they pick up hoes or spreadsheets, bricks or audit reports, and begin to fix what they can reach. So here's where this story leaves us. 2 nations, 2 kinds of revolutions, each with lessons for the other, and for all of us. If you followed this journey from the dusty farms of Burkina Faso to the restless streets of Nairobi, ask yourself, Which path speaks more to your spirit? The calm of trust that says, we will build this ourselves? Or the sharp vigilance that says, prove to me where every coin goes? Maybe the real hope lies in combining both. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below. And if you believe Africa deserves stories like this, full of hard questions, real people, and genuine hope, please like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe to our channel to stay updated.